Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us in our series of webinars for National History Day. I'm Ellen Dornan. I'm the state coordinator for National History Day, and I work with the New Mexico Humanities Council, which is the sponsor for National History Day in New Mexico. Today, I'm incredibly excited that we're joined by Assistant State Historian Robert Martinez. And Robert and I met many years ago as judges for National History Day, and we discovered quickly that we share a mutual passion for New Mexico history. And so Robert is joining us to tell some stories of conflict and compromise in New Mexico history. And I have to say, I'm just so excited to start this conversation. I'm going to do it without further ado. If anybody watching has questions, please go ahead and enter them in the chat on the YouTube page if you're watching live. You can also email your questions to me at historyday@nmhum.org, and we'll try and get them answered during our webcast. So thank you so much for joining us today, Rob.
Hello everybody. Thank you for having me.
So with a conflict and compromise in New Mexico, how far ago does it go back? What can we tell these stories?
Well, conflict and compromise, that is history, isn't it? It's history. Our history here goes back thousands of years with the Pueblo people. We know there must have been some sort of conflict and compromising going on with the Chaco civilization in the 1300s, and then all of a sudden that community ended, and those people ended up founding and establishing communities along the Rio Grande that we know today, more or less. And we know that those different peoples, they had to have different languages. So we know that they have stories. I'm sure if anybody were to contact the Pueblo Indian Cultural Center, someone like Rose Diaz over there, she's a very nice lady, very knowledgeable. There would be a lot of information about their history. They have a lot of stories, interesting, fascinating history. Some of it's prehistory, but that right there, that's the oldest thing we have here. New Mexico belongs first to the Pueblo people. But out of the gate, you get some conflict and some compromising in the 1500s with Spaniards coming here, exploring. You have Estevanico, the first official Spanish representative to the Pueblos at Zuni in 1539, and he's African. And there's conflict right there. The Zuni people kill him, but this starts Spanish presence in this area. Coronado and his soldiers in 1540, 42, very, very controversial. They're looking for mineral wealth, and they conflict with the local Pueblo people and have a violent response to the Pueblos. So they don't leave a very good first impression, and they leave. So I'm not sure if that's maybe that's the biggest compromise of all, when the Spaniards leave, but they return. There are other entradas into New Mexico, Castaño de Sosa, but they're illegal. And it's 1598 that Juan de Oñate leads the first colonization into New Mexico. And there's all kinds of conflict, not just with Oñate and the colonists, with the people of Acoma, but with the people at Okeawinge, which was San Juan Pueblo, and even the colonists conflict amongst themselves. Many abandon the colony. That's their compromise. They get the heck out of here. And the ones who stay have to work and compromise with the Pueblo people. So, you know, Oñate himself is actually removed from New Mexico, both for having supposedly abused Pueblo people and colonists. So there's plenty of examples. I can go on and on. Do you want me to keep talking, or?
Well, you know what? I want to break down some of those stories a little bit. So, for instance, you mentioned the Siege of Acoma.
Yes.
And I mean, that is, you know, an epic story. And there was a very interesting primary source document for it, right?
Well,
A poem, right?
there are these events were recorded in government documents. We don't have those here. Some of those are stored in places like the National Archives in Mexico City. There's also a wonderful source for Spanish colonial documents in Spain called PARES, P-A-R-E-S, Portal de Archivos Españoles. That's online, and they have Oñate documents there. You have to be able to read old Spanish documents. You need to know paleography to read them. But, you know, Hammond and Ray, they have a multi-volume study of the Oñate events that you can find at the libraries in Albuquerque, the genealogy libraries you can find it at the Southwest Room of the State Library at the New Mexico Commission of Public Records, right there with the New Mexico State Archives and Records Center. So there are sources to look at what happened, at least from the Spanish perspective.
Right. So, you know, when we're talking about what happened, I guess one of the questions that I would ask is, how do you see the compromise? And what we've been talking about with compromise in History Day is one way to look at compromise is mutual concessions.
Well,
so there's somebody gives up something and somebody gives up something. So how would you tell a story like the Siege of Acoma when talking about compromise?
Well, let's talk about first when Oñate and the colonists come up here. They make their way up the Rio Grande, and they get to the pueblo just north of present-day Española. And the first thing they do is remove the pueblo people from their homes so they'll have a place to stay. I'd like to think that the Pueblo people were also very accommodating. There were a lot of Pueblo people and not that many Spanish people. So I think you had right there a give and take, a compromise. I think the Pueblos were really willing to compromise and give up their homes for the Spanish to live in. But then you have Acoma, which is less willing to help the Spanish. They're a little bit more independent minded. They're a little bit more isolated out west of the Rio Grande. And who can blame them? They don't know who these Spanish people are or what they're here for. They're an alien force in the area. So when two nephews of Oñate are exploring to the west, they stop by Acoma to get supplies, and they're ambushed, and one of them is killed. So Oñate consults the Franciscans to see if he has cause for a just war, and from their perspective, they do. So he sends the other nephews, another Zaldivar nephew, and some of the colonists with names we recognize: Archuleta, Romero, Martin Serrano, Martinez now. And these folks go over there and they go to war with the Acoma people. In the aftermath, the document says that Oñate ordered that men over the age of 24 have one of their feet cut off. And after that, Spanish authority is imposed. And it's successful to a point, but many of the colonists abandon New Mexico. They don't find the wealth they wanted to find. So that's their compromise. They leave. But many stay, again, with the names like Martinez and Romero and Archuleta, Montoya. They stay, and they work with the Pueblos the best they can. These people were not farmers. They were not agrarian people, but they have to learn to be, and much of what they learned from the Pueblo people. So there's got to be some give and take and compromising after that auspicious beginning. So I think from the get-go, there's some conflict, and it doesn't necessarily go away. It's kind of the trademark of the 1600s, moving those Spaniards out of the Pueblo Okeawinge to establish Santa Fe starting around 1608 into 1610. That's one way of compromising and learning to get along, is the Spanish people finding their own place to live. And that's what they do. But, you know, there's all kinds of a give and take going on for the next 80, 70 or 80 years between governors and Franciscans, a lot of conflict and disagreement between them. It goes back and forth, and the Pueblos are caught in between them. And finally, they lose their patience. The Pueblo people, they lose their patience. In the 1670s, there's famine, there's drought, and the Pueblo people start to fear that their spirits have abandoned them because they became Catholic and abandoned the spirits. So they go back into their kivas. The Spaniards punish them, and they had had enough. In 1680, they revolt and say, we want to have our own culture, and we want to have our land, and we want to have a say in how we live. So the Spaniards were driven out of here, and many, again, there was another diaspora. Many left south and never to return. But many remained in what's now Juarez, Guadalupe del Paso. So there's a whole lot of compromising going on there. They're waiting to be brought back. They have names like Martinez and Montoya and Romero and Chavez and Baca. And when Diego de Vargas is appointed governor of New Mexico in the early 1690s, he has to find a way to make this work. He returns, he brings more Spanish soldiers and those New Mexican colonists who by that time, there's a lot of compromises shown, because by that time we're mixed blood. We have Native American blood, Pueblo blood, but we also still have our Spanish roots. And when Vargas returns in 1692, there's a compromise. The Pueblos welcome Spanish presence, probably to help fight off intruding Comanches and Apaches, Navajos, and that's what is called the bloodless reconquest, but it's very short-lived. Within a year, more colonists are recruited from Mexico City and Zacatecas, and when these colonists are brought in 1693, Santa Fe has to be taken by force of arms. So the picture I'm trying to paint is that conflict and compromise are a constant thing in New Mexico history.
Well, and I can certainly appreciate that. I think I think for the History Day kids, History Day students, certainly what they want to be doing is sort of connecting, because of this conflict, there was this compromise, or because they made the compromise this way, like you were talking about difficulties between the church and the state. So because the state made certain compromises, it led to the church expecting certain things, and then there was a conflict. So it can work in both directions, or you can have a conflict with no compromise. Like you could say cutting off all the feet of the Ackermans was no compromise at all. But
there, yeah. Well, and the compromise can be short-lived. I mean, look at what happens. The Pueblos revolt, but then when the Spanish return, it's a little shaky. They come back 1692, 1693, 1696, 1697. The Pueblos are still wanting to remove the Spanish. They're not sure they want these people around. But what happens in the following century is a lot of compromising. The Pueblos and the Hispano people have to really learn to work together. They're in a constant state of war with the Comanches. So they have their internal conflicts, and yet they work together to combat the fierce warriors of the Comanches. And there's all kinds of examples in the 1700s of conflict and compromise. At Abiquiu Pueblo, the Genízaro Indians there, they are partially Catholicized and Hispanicized, but they still retain their Plains Indian culture and religious beliefs. So it results in a priest out there, Fray Juan José Toledo, thinking that there's a outbreak of witchcraft and sorcery. Okay, So there's a whole tumult going on there. And the Inquisition in Mexico City was consulted, and the Inquisition actually said that it was the priests' fault, that they were not doing a good job of Christianizing these people, and they needed to learn their languages and do a better job. But that's the compromise, right? It didn't result in the burnings or hangings you saw in Salem in 1692, but also the Comanche peace under Governor Anza. The Comanches are finally, how shall I say, they are compromised in a sense. They're bought off by the Spanish. They're bought off, and that lasts for a few decades, but then it starts up again in the 1800s. And we know that there's a Mexican period where we're dealing with Apacheria in the south and Comanches in the north. And when the Americans come here, that's another conflict. American government, American civilization coming into conflict with Spanish Mexican civilization, religious views. How do you view land? Spanish and Mexican views of land are very different from American. You have common lands, how you mark off a land grant. The king ultimately still owns all the land in the Spanish system, whereas in the United States, the American system, a person owns their land, and land is fenced off, and common lands are not known. So this is a conflict, and it's been a conflict that's been going on for over 100 years now.
I actually did put every land grant history ever as a topic for conflict and compromise in New Mexico history, because I think you can pick any one of those stories and come up with a very complex tale of how people came to understand each other. But what you're saying makes me have a question for you, which is one of the things we're asking students to do this year is look at how the themes of conflict and compromise happen. What causes groups to come into conflict? Is it easier for some cultures to compromise? Why may some parties fail to compromise? And what is difficult about coming to a compromise? So if we're looking at something like, Becknell brings his wagon train down the Santa Fe Trail in 1821, and there's this meeting of cultures for the first time, or even looking back to, say, Zebulon Pike, what led the parties to be in conflict in these cases, and what incentives did they have to come to a compromise?
Well, you're talking about a lot of things here, and what you look at are things like empire building. Okay, Spain was doing it in the 1500s, Portugal was doing it in the 1600s, Britain was doing it, then France and the Dutch, and these people are fighting each other in Europe, and they're vying for territory in places like Africa, and of course in the Americas and even Asia. So that's a good question. What is motivating it? What happens when you build an empire? Well, you're bound to have conflict, because when you build an empire, one group is overtaking another group, and it changes the group that's being taken over. It's not a nice process to have to go through. No one wants to be on the receiving end of that. But it also changes the empire builders. Do you see what I'm saying? It changes them as well. It changes the nature of their culture, because they're incorporating other cultures into their empire. And one of the main motivating factors we have to acknowledge is economics. People wanting access to resources, people wanting access to food, to water, to markets. Columbus didn't wake up one day and say, I would love to travel the ocean blue and make a bunch of Native Americans miserable. He woke up and he was an explorer, a cartographer, a sailor, and Spain needed access to markets in Asia, because the Ottoman Turks had cut Spain and Portugal out of those markets. Portugal found a way around Africa to get there. So Spain had to find another way, and Columbus said, I know a way. Okay, so that was market driven. It also helps if you have a strong sense of nationalism and an idea that, you know, your civilization is better, your religion is better. And, you know, the Spaniards, they had a 700-year war with Moorish Muslims in Spain. And after that 700 years, they had what we would call in the 1800s a sense of manifest destiny, that they were chosen to rule the world because they had done something so amazing. But hey, interacting with Muslims for 700 years had changed them too, biologically, culturally, in every way possible. So I mean, that's what you have to look at. What are the economics? Why, you know, why is America coming west? Why are they needing to rule from sea to shining sea? It was quite easy up until they ran into Mexico. They wanted to buy the Southwest from Mexico, and Mexico said no. And why would they? They wanted to keep their national borders. So a conflict arose. Sometimes conflicts are created to justify things. And so that's what you have to look at, is what are the real causes? What are the real motivating factors? You know, Spain, why did Spain need to have a northern territory in New Mexico? Well, because France and England were also making noise to the east of here, and they needed to protect their wealth in Mexico and Peru. There's always a reason. You have to look at what are the causes of things and what are the effects. What happens after, like you're doing here, conflict and compromise. What causes a conflict? You have to look deep to find that, and then that helps to find the definition of what your compromise is going to be.
So to what extent do you see language? You mentioned that the priests up in Abiquiu were chastised for not being able to minister to their flock appropriately because they couldn't even speak people's language, and that comes up again with different ecclesiastic reviews of the missions, right? That the people who are working most closely with the Puebloans don't speak the language. And so to what extent do you see language, or alternately like religion, playing a role in some of the conflicts and compromise stories that you see in New Mexico?
Well, there's going to be conflict. Catholicism, Spanish Catholicism, there's a certain contradiction, I think, if you look at, and that's not a bad thing when I say a contradiction. What I mean is Catholicism has its set beliefs and dogmas, and yet it's always been able to adapt to local cultures. Okay, it's always been able to adapt and to absorb, and then to a point be syncretic with local cultures. And, you know, there's Spanish Catholicism, and if you go to Italy, there's a kind of Italian Catholicism. If you go to France, there's a certain flavor. So when you get to Mexico in the 1500s, the Franciscan priests, they're dealing with some very powerful and very strong civilizations down there with their own polytheistic belief systems. So they have to contend with that. On the one hand, they're very they're not willing to compromise on some certain things, and you find that up here when the Franciscans come up here. They find a certain pantheistic spirituality. The kivas are a little strange to them. The dances are even stranger to them. It's very foreign to them. So they say, no, we're not going to compromise on this. But there had to be a certain amount of accommodation into the 1700s and 1800s because the Pueblos still have their belief systems. So they weren't eradicated. So, but that's a very good question, because that was what the Franciscans had to do, was they had to catechize these folks, and they brought a Spanish language. That's the lingua franca the common language of Spanish Empire. And the native peoples here, they don't even speak one native language. They have many different languages amongst the Pueblos, never mind the Plains Indians that become Genízaro Indians. So I could see from the Franciscan point of view, it could be quite daunting learning the language, but I'm sure some did. And but that definitely contributes to, you know, walking a fine line between dealing with the conflict between religious systems and compromising and picking your battles. Some of the Franciscans were very good at communicating with the Pueblo people. I have to think they were, because these priests, there were one or two in the Pueblos. They were not big men, and they were dealing with very advanced people, the Pueblo people, who could have just got rid of them right away. So they were able to work with them somehow. And I can't believe it was just by force. I think they had a way of working together. But you have to definitely look at that aspect of conflict and compromising with religious systems. And you need to learn about those religious systems. You need to learn how the native systems, they tended to, when they would come into contact with other groups, whether they were Spanish or other Native American groups, they tended to take from that civilization what they found useful, and maybe not accept what they didn't find useful. So if another group were to come along and they found something in their religion that they liked, they would absorb it. They would use it. Whereas Catholicism is less open to that. It's that simple. So I think there's a lot of give and take there. I mean, there's stories of Franciscans in the 1700s grabbing those cachinas out of the kivas and burning them.
Right.
So that was conflict right there, you know. But then they would have to compromise and work with the Pueblos, showing them how to be a Catholic, and I'm sure that they had to learn some of the native language in order to communicate.
Well, I think almost in some ways, just translating some of the imagery, being able to tell some of the stories or connect some of the characters to people must have required some kind of compromise in their minds. But I think some of this is kind of hard to document. I know that there are a few episodes that we can pick out from history where the certainly contributed to the roots of the Pueblo Revolt, for example, but more modern conflicts like at Laguna Pueblo, or conflicts between the largely Protestant Americans and the largely Catholic New Mexicans, because I know that created a lot of distrust on both sides. I think a lot of New Mexicans feared that they would lose their right to worship in the way that they wanted to.
Well, yeah, you know, obviously the United States is a very free, open society, but it had its prejudices. And, you know, Catholicism was looked at as almost pagan, for lack of a better word. Yeah, it's funny how you look at history, and under the Spanish system, the Spanish looked at the Pueblos as pagan and foreign, and then the Americans come and look at the Pueblo people and the Hispanic people as pagan and foreign.
Everybody uses the word idolatrous, right?
Yeah.
Idolatry.
But you bring up some excellent examples. Look, when Fray Juan José Toledo starts to experience what he sees as an outbreak of demonic manifestation in Abiquiu, he just does what he thinks he's supposed to do. He tells the governor, he tells his superiors, and their exorcisms are performed, and trials are held. About 11 or 12 Genízaro Indians are imprisoned. These are conflicts that really happened, and the compromises might work better for the Spanish than they did for the Genízaro Indians. You know, go forward to the mid-1800s. Boy, you know, we are Spanish for over 200 years, then we become part of the new nation of Mexico. So we're part of the birth of that nation. Think about that. We were part of Spain's world empire. Then we were part of Mexico. And then the United States comes over here, and yeah, you have all kinds of conflict on many different levels. How do you deal with land grants? How do you deal with the Spanish language? How do you deal with the penitentes? You know, all of a sudden we're made into a diocese, and Bishop LeMay is sent over here. He's a Frenchman, and he looks at New Mexico with a lot of disdain, and he doesn't really like the local priests, especially the native-born priests, like people like Padre Antonio Jose Martinez, Father Martinez of Taos, who had a different view of the Catholic religion. Not necessarily a wrong view, just different, and it came into conflict with LeMay, especially over things like the penitentes. That penitentes horrified LeMay. Martinez worked with the penitentes. They were a local lay brotherhood of Catholic men. So a lot of that is theological. A lot of it is cultural conflict. And we know
some even going back to the French-Spanish tensions of old Europe, right? I mean,
no, I mean, there's prejudices on all sides that manifest or re-manifest right here in little old New Mexico. You know, we sometimes think of ourselves out in the middle of nowhere where nothing happened, when actually world history has converged and clashed here. Native peoples, native empires, a Spanish empire, Mexican nationhood, the United States expanding west, manifest destiny. It's all happening right here. And for National History Day, that's one thing I would focus on, is squaring local historical events in a not only local sense, but in a regional, national, and even international framework.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, I sidetracked you a little bit talking about sort of the sources of conflict, or, you know, why different people might have trouble compromising. But I think we left New Mexico somewhere post secularization, so a Mexican territorial period. So the next big conflict is really the coming of the Army of the West. Do you want to?
Well, yeah. I mean, we know that there's Mexico has tried to purchase the Southwest. There's a lot of history here, but we can't go into all of it. But Texas is Texas secedes from Mexico, and then the United States annexes Texas. This is in the 1830s, 1836, 1837. And then obviously that creates major tensions between the United States and Mexico. Mexico's not happy with that situation. Well, we are Mexico, and we're the ones who have a border now with the United States. And at one point, Texas claims the Rio Grande as their eastern border. And New Mexico says, absolutely not. That's not going to happen, and it didn't happen. So yeah, so what happens is under President Polk, a war is started with Mexico because Mexico will not sell the rest of the Southwest, extending from New Mexico to California. So Mexico does what she has to, and you have a war between a major conflict going on, and we're right there. We're right in it. And you know, you have people like Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant. They're calling the war a moral disaster for the United States, and it's controversial. The United States wins, but doesn't just take the Southwest, but pays Mexico some money for it. And then, you know, you have to study the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It's almost like any treaty, it's one-sided, but it's also saying, you know, we'll honor your land grants. You know, the loophole is you have to have the original land grant, the paper, and many of the Hispanics didn't. So the Pueblos were able to produce the Cruzate land grants, which have a whole history all on their own. But many Hispanos they just had a verbal knowledge of their land, or they had copies because the originals had, from the 1700s, had deteriorated. So American law was overcoming Mexican and Spanish law. So, you know, the Army of the West is sent to solidify American dominance, to occupy, invade and occupy. And that's what happens. And obviously, Kearny ends up going from here to California to, again, extend American rule. And there's all kinds of documents, newspaper articles about New Mexican attitudes. Some New Mexican attitudes are very pro-American. Many are, they lament the loss of Mexicanhood, you know? So like anything, again, as I said when we started this, yes, Spanish people came here and imposed themselves on Pueblo people, but then the Americans came in here and imposed themselves on Pueblo people and Hispanic people. Mm-hmm. And the compromise comes over the next 60 years. We are a territory. We're not considered worthy of statehood. Students can study what politicians back east had to say about us. We were fanatical mixed bloods and savage Indians who did not deserve American citizenship. The compromise comes later on when there's a movement to turn us into Spanish people so that we'll be more palatable as a state when we become a state in 1912. And that's one of the reasons why so many of us Hispanics to this day say, oh, we're Spanish, we're Spanish. Mm-hmm. Well, we have Spanish roots like Mexico does, but we came through the same historical trajectory as Mexico. So there's a lot of compromising going on. That's one of the compromises. We become Spanish to become a state. But then over the 1900s, the 20th century, we start reclaiming our culture and reclaiming our history. And, you know, we talk about conflict and compromise about land grants. Well, it all explodes in New Mexico in 1967 when a guy from Texas named Reyes Lopez Tijerina leads a bunch of New Mexicans into the courthouse at Tierra Maria to do a citizen's arrest and to bring the attention of the United States government to the fact that Hispanic people have claim to lands in this part of the world, in New Mexico, going back to the 1700s and the 1600s.
I do have a question from about the story of Reyes Tijerina. So one of our students last year won nationals with an exhibit on Tijerina. Yes. And came back and the teacher got him, and the girl got kind of low marks in some ways, and it really seemed like it really seemed like it was possible that do a good job of explaining the impact, or that they didn't understand the issues at stake somehow. So, you know, maybe there are things that we take for granted in New Mexico that any New Mexico NHD judge is going to know about the land grants. But, you know, knowing what a limited format students have to work with, what advice would you give to somebody who's trying to sort of balance giving the context of land grant conflicts or any one of these New Mexican stories, right? Yeah. Trying to give some context for people, for judges back east?
Well, that's a challenge. Back east, I've been back east. I love it back east, by the way. I think it's amazing. They have an amazing history over there, but I think they tend to think history begins over there. And I think that's one of the prejudices that students from New Mexico have to come up with a way to overcome. Okay, and I'm not blaming them, you know, but I've been to Mount Vernon and I thought, wow, this is just like the Martinez Hacienda in Taos. So you can kind of maybe square it like that and say, okay, you have Mount Vernon, but we have Father Martinez's family Hacienda in Taos, and you have this, but we have that. Draw parallels. And, you know, really, again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's squaring our history in a a national and international framework so that people know it does matter. I mean, we were part of Spain's empire. That's why it's important. You know, that's why Spanish is spoken in the United States. Not important. The first European language spoken in what is now the United States is Spanish. So it's important. You know, we were part of Mexico. That's part of our national dialogue. It's not important. The United States became a very Mexican nation in 1848. You know, it goes back to that when you build an empire, you need to be careful what you're asking for, because those people you're incorporating into your nation are going to change you. So I think it's important to square it that way. In the 20th century, you have the atomic bomb changed world history. It started right here in New Mexico. And you talk about conflict and compromise, talk about the complexities of Cold War history. It's happening right here. After World War II, we had to have German scientists come to places like New Mexico to help us develop weapons to fight the Soviet Union. And Truman did not want any Nazis over here, so they would get their resumes and dossiers and they'd put a made-up resume with a paperclip. That's Operation Paperclip, so that they would be desirable. And yeah, you had Nazi scientists running around here. That's quite a compromise, don't you think? But goes back to your original point. I think New Mexican students have a little bit more work to do, but you have to be aggressive about it, and you have to know what you're talking about, and let those people back east know why this is important. That Tijerina is right up there with Cesar Chavez, Angel Gutierrez of Texas, and Corky Gonzalez of Colorado, and Martin Luther King, and all of those great civil rights warriors. Okay.
Well, I think that's a really inspiring way to look at it, and I do hope that New Mexico students are coming out of this as inspired as I am to go into some juicy New Mexico history, because we have the funnest stories. Let's be honest, right?
We have so much. I mean, even obviously there's not a lot you can do with, you can do stuff with images from the colonial period and Mexican period. You can use maps, you can use even Mexican period newspaper articles. There are maps from the colonial period and reports and documents that have been transcribed and translated into English that can be used. But my gosh, I know when I taught high school, I loved using photographs with students. You can extract so much information from a photograph. I used to use a photograph of a young boy working in a factory when we would study the Industrial Revolution. And I'd ask the students questions. What do you see here? What's going on? Look how the child is dressed. Is he wearing shoes? No, he's not. These children would lose toes. They would lose fingers. They would have to work 18, 20 hours. And, you know, I've given talks on the Tierra Maria raid, and some of those most powerful images are Hispanic people of northern New Mexico being put in an animal corral by the National Guard and the police. Or, you know, there's a great photo of a local Hispano up there in the norte on his horse with the bringing on a baby horse, and there's a tank right there. And the soldiers are looking at him and he's looking at them. That's conflict right there. You know, civilizations coming into conflict, and those images are powerful. I think something like that would be very useful when you get back east.
It puts me in mind of some of the great encounter photographs I've seen. Like there's one of his hair sort of styled traditionally with a hairband, and he's on his horse, and there's a real shiny new sort of 1920s roadster. It must have been right when they raised in, because there it is, all paved, and he's on his horse. Yes. Or like some of the train photos of the train coming into Laguna or whatever, and women there, and like you said, it's the marketplace, right? That's their compromise. Okay, well, you're coming through our lands, but you know, let's do some business.
Yeah, and we're still living with that right now. This is not just stuff in the past. I mean, I've used some of the very sad and terrible signs that used to be put up in places like the South, the whites only. Even in El Paso, I saw a sign: no Indians, no Mexicans, no dogs. And I wish we could say we were just studying this stuff in the past, but we're still dealing with conflict in our regional history, our national history, and our international history. So the whole point of history is, I think, is to educate ourselves about not just interesting things that happen, but terrible things that happen, so that we can either not repeat them, or if we find ourselves in the middle of them, how do we deal with them? And I think that those are the lessons we could learn, whether you're a Pueblo warrior fighting for your culture in 1680, or if you're a Hispanic Hispano from northern New Mexico fighting for your cultural survival in the 1800s and 1900s. It's all around us. That's what makes New Mexico history so fascinating. It's right in your face. It's not just in the past.
Rob, I am so sorry that we are out of time. This has just been absolutely pleasurable experience talking New Mexico history with you. And I do want to remind everybody that our next webinar will be State Historian Hendricks, who will be on this to talk about where you can go to do primary source research on New Mexico history. But once again, Rob, thank you so much. Really appreciate you joining us today, and thank you for all your passion and enthusiasm for history.
Got it. Thank you for having me.
All right. Hang on just 1 second when I stop, okay?